Is Southwest Airlines about to buy up a competitor? And if that's the case, why? And could that actually be the death blow to Boeing's smallest MAX variant, the 737 MAX-7? Stay tuned. Whenever we talk about large professional corporations, we rarely use the term wacky to describe them. But if the CEO of an organization challenges another CEO to an arm wrestling match in order to solve a dispute, well then wacky is kind of a good description, isn't it? This actually happened back in 1992 when Southwest's first CEO and co-founder, Herbert Kelleher, was told that the airline couldn't use the slogan "just plain smart" since another company, Stevens Aviation, was already using it. And the solution? Well, that arm wrestling match, obviously.
Any fool could see what was coming.
Now, to be honest, the whole thing basically became a huge publicity stunt for both of these companies. And if you want to spend half an hour getting a surreal glimpse of the early 1990s, complete with period-correct wrestling, smoking in public, and special haircuts, well then you're in luck, because all of this is available on YouTube in its full glory. But just because they are wacky and keen to laugh at themselves, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't take Southwest seriously. They are currently the fourth largest carrier in the United States by revenue, behind only the big three, Delta, American and United. Southwest is also third in terms of passengers flown, behind American and Delta, and first on domestic passenger numbers in the US. And on top of that, they also have the fourth largest aircraft fleet in the world. But there are also other things that Southwest does, which clearly sets them apart from other airlines. They aren't the world's first low-cost carrier, since Pacific Southwest, or PSA, started that way back in 1949, but they are the airline that basically wrote the book on how to be a successful low-cost carrier on a really big scale. Southwest were first incorporated in Texas back in 1966, and the goal was then to start operations in the following year under the name Air Southwest & Company. The initial plan was to only operate flights within Texas, using a fleet of Boeing 737-200s. The reason they were limiting themselves to Texas only was a regulatory one. You see, before 1978, airline routes and fares were tightly controlled by a federal body called the Civil Aeronautics Board. And this board basically stopped airlines from competing too much with each other in order to protect their profitability. And that anti-competitive policy obviously kept the ticket prices up in the whole of the US. Now, all of that went away with the Airline Deregulation Act, which I covered over on another video. But if you wanted to start a low-cost airline before that, like Southwest wanted, well, then you needed to keep that airline operating only at state level, since the Federal Civil Aeronautics Board didn't have any say there. Now, what actually ended up happening was that Southwest didn't actually start carrying any passengers until in 1971, due to some lawsuits from other airlines who really wanted to stop them from starting in the first place. This was, of course, because they could see that the lack of federal limits meant that Southwest could seriously undercut them on their prices, and they really didn't like that. Eventually, those airlines settled with Southwest, who could then finally get their operations started, and they quickly gained experience by flying throughout Texas. And as soon as the Deregulation Act came into effect in 1978, they immediately expanded out of the state, taking the low-fare model with them and making it popular nationwide.
If you've got $19, they're available now. If not, never mind. And we'll have fun flying Southwest on a fun Thursday.
So at this point, I probably need to explain a little bit more about what it actually means for an airline to be a low-cost carrier. Because without doing that, it will be hard to then explain Southwest's issues with their current fleet plans and the 737 MAX-7 in particular. Now, there are some differences between the United States and Europe regarding what the term low-cost carrier, or LCC, actually means. Generally speaking, what we call low-cost carriers over here in Europe are what the Americans call ultra-low-cost carriers, or ULCCs. From a passenger's perspective, flying on a ULCC in the States typically means traveling on an all-economy passenger cabin, using a ticket that doesn't include food or check-in bags, and in many cases not even a carry-on bag. No frills. Passengers also often lack other perks like choosing their own seat or the ability to change their flights, unless they agree to pay an additional charge, of course. But Southwest are actually one step above that. Their passengers still can't rebook a specific seat. It's an open cabin, so you can sit wherever you like, although different fares comes with different boarding options. More importantly, even basic tickets include 2 checked-in bags, but as for food, they don't include any meals, but you can look forward to some tasty pretzels. This is what it's normally like to fly with low-cost carriers in general and Southwest in particular, but those leaner basic fares and fewer perks are actually not what makes an airline into a true low-cost carrier. To understand what does that, we have to look at the airline operational side of things, and that's where Southwest's planned use of the Boeing 737 MAX comes in. And I'll explain how. Not again. Have you ever wondered how these spammers get a hold of your email and name so easily? Well, as it turns out, there's a whole shady industry out there where companies known as data brokers can sell your information to marketing companies, banks, and even criminals completely legally. Now, you could go through the hassle of asking all of these brokers individually to remove your data from their services, but that's a huge pain to do. And that's where today's sponsor, Incogni, comes in. You see, when you sign up to them, they will reach out to all of these companies on your behalf and then demand that your data is removed. They will then monitor compliance and continuously scan for any new companies selling your data for as long as you stay as a customer. When I signed up, I quickly got access to their dashboard and was shocked to see that my data was being sold by over 60 different data brokers. Incogni are dealing with all of them right now, and it's easy to follow their progress both on the dashboard and in my inbox. So, if you want to give Incogni a try and start protecting your online privacy, then use the link here below, which is incogni.com/mentor now. If you use that, together with the code MENTORNOW, you'll get a whopping 60% discount on the annual plan. Thank you, Incogni. Now, where was I again? Yeah. To make the low-cost carrier model work, an airline has to minimize their operational costs as much as humanly possible. There are a couple of different ways to do this, and to understand them, you need to know that for an airline, some of the biggest operating costs that they can control are their fuel bills and the cost of purchasing, leasing, or otherwise financing their aircraft. Now, you might think that low-cost carriers might try to operate older aircraft in order to keep those purchasing or lease costs low, kind of like how a cheap taxi company would use older cars. And early on in their existence, a lot of airlines actually had to do that. But older aircraft burn more fuel and generally also require much more maintenance, spare parts, and downtime, so that's far from ideal. Now, that can still work under certain conditions, even though low-cost carriers doing that are definitely the exception. Because if you look at, for example, Southwest's fleet, it shows that the average age of their over 800 aircraft fleet is under 12 years old, and I'll get back to that later. Now, of course, new aircraft cost a lot of money, and while Southwest has operated successfully long enough to be able to buy new aircraft outright if they want to, and they do, other low-cost carriers will need to lease their new jets instead, and that leasing costs a lot of money. It's kind of like renting a luxury house instead of buying it. So how do the airlines get around this huge expense then? Well, if they don't have the money to just buy the jets, this cost is very hard to avoid, but they can minimize the effect of the problem by spreading the cost out over more flights. In other words, airlines who are using a fleet of new leased jets needs to operate these jets a lot. An aircraft doesn't make any money when it's sitting on the ground, so successful low-cost carriers do what they can to make sure that their jets stay in the air as often and as long as possible. Hence the short turnaround times, for example. But that's easier said than done. Keeping a large aircraft fleet in the air for as long as possible and having nearly all seats full for all of those flights can be a planning nightmare. Whole books have been written on how to do this, but in short, to fly a big fleet of full planes consistently, an airline needs a good amount of computer power, savvy personnel, and maybe most importantly, the right route network and fleet. And this finally brings us to the Boeing 737. Having a single aircraft type is another characteristic shared by almost all low-cost carriers, because this saves costs in maintenance, spares, and also training for pilots and engineers. Operationally, making sure that all of your pilots can fly all of your aircraft is a great advantage since it makes the operation really nimble and flexible. Now, Personally, I can't even count how many times that I've been asked to just jump over and fly a different flight in a different aircraft than I was originally planned to do, and that's only possible with a uniform fleet. So from the very start, Southwest has always flown an all 737 fleet, with the exception of some 727s that they used briefly for a couple of seasons in the late 1970s and early 80s, I think. Anyway, Southwest has actually been the launch customer for several 737 variants, including the 737-300 and the even smaller 500. And they also launched the 737NG with orders for the 737-700. And unless the plans change, they will do the same for the 737-7 or MAX-7. Now, the original plan for this, the smallest 737 MAX variant, was to enter service sometime in the early 2019. Obviously, that didn't happen. The first MAX-7 began test flying early in 2018, just a few months before the fatal crash of the bigger MAX-8, and that obviously abruptly halted the test program. And before last January's blowout accident, Southwest and Boeing were expecting the first MAX-7 to enter service later this year, in 2024. But as I explained in previous videos, new scrutiny on the MAX plus some additional changes to the engine nacelles and the whole MAX family will mean that the plane's certification now won't happen before 2025, and it could actually take even longer than that. A few weeks after the incident in January, Southwest confirmed that they had removed the MAX-7 from their fleet plans for 2024. And when they were queried about this, they added that they are prepared to wait for it until 2026 or 2027 if necessary. To put that in perspective, remember that when Southwest first ordered this aircraft, they expected to get it in 2019, so this is a pretty bad delay. But Southwest also has some orders for the bigger MAX-8, so until the smaller variant is certified, Boeing has just been switching deliveries of that smaller plane over to the bigger one. This means that for the time being at least, Southwest is still getting new 737s to keep their fleet where it should be, at least in terms of numbers. This was true until recently, because early in May they announced that they were now expecting to only take delivery of 20 737s this year, out of the 79 that they had originally planned. Now before 2024, Southwest's fleet was growing slowly, as we can see here. During the last 10 years or so, it looks like the fleet has been slowly growing to its current size, with just a few fluctuations along the way. And of course, there was a big dip because of the MAX groundings and the pandemic, but after that the aircraft numbers have started climbing again. But looking simply at the total number of aircraft per year is actually hiding the real nature of Southwest's fleet problems. Remember when I said earlier that in order for a low-cost carrier to operate their fleet profitably, they needed to keep their planes in the air and all of their seats full, and that this required the right aircraft for the route network? Well, Southwest has been improving and honing their network for decades, but to do that they have always used smaller aircraft. That's because they are flying the routes point to point, and as I've explained in many of my other videos, point-to-point flights generally favor smaller aircraft. So it's not a coincidence that the 4 737 variants that Southwest has been the launch customer for, including the 737 MAX-7, were all the smaller versions of the jet. So with that in mind, let's look at Southwest's current fleet development a little bit more closely. In 2016, before they started taking deliveries of the 737 MAX-8, they had a total of 723 aircraft, of which 494 were of the smaller 737-700 variant. They also had 87 older 737-300s, which are nearly identical in size to the 700. Now, for most airlines who fly the 737, including mine, the 737-800 is by far the most popular variant they use, and yet out of Southwest's 723 jets that they had that year, only 142 were 737-800 models. Now, the 737 MAX-8 is a direct replacement of the 800, and those two are practically the same size. As I said earlier, Southwest is now continuing to take deliveries of MAX-8s while they wait for the smaller MAX-7. The airline is doing this because they have no choice. And remember what the average age of their fleet was? Yeah, just under 12 years old. And the problem is that the average age of their smaller 737-700s in particular is actually way higher than that, nearly 19 years. Now, Southwest could try to extend the service of some of those older 737-700s as they wait for the newer, small 737s, but they can only do that to a limited extent. You see, buying new aircraft and then selling them when they still are fresh enough to have some residual value is an art form in itself, and another way for airlines to make money, something that Southwest also have to take into account. So as we now go forward through the years, and as Southwest continues to replace their old, smaller 737-700s with new, bigger 737 MAX 8, the shape of their fleet and the emphasis on smaller aircraft is changing dramatically. Basically, they're adding way more seats to their network than they had originally planned. In 2023, Southwest ended the year with 817 aircraft, and out of these, only 387 were 737-700s, who have the 143 passenger seat configuration. The remaining 430 aircraft were a mix of the bigger 737-800s and the MAX 8s, which Southwest have fitted with 175 seats. In other words, in 2016, only 19.6% of Southwest aircraft had 175 seats, but in 2023, that same figure is 52.6%, and that is a seriously big shift, which the airline did not plan or ask for. And as it turns out, randomly adding 32 extra seats on most of their route network just doesn't work for them. To make matters worse, as demand for travel started to tick upwards in 2022, Southwest also introduced new routes to try and snatch some market share away from competitors who were unable to scale up operations as quickly as they could. This meant that their network became more fragmented and inefficient, which is something that they're trying to fix now, just as their fleet is growing and their load factor is dropping like a stone. Load factor, by the way, is the percentage of available seats that are being filled with passengers. So while Southwest might have said back in January that there is still room for the MAX-7 in their fleet, even if they have to wait until 2026 or 27 for it, in reality, with the overall aircraft deliveries dropping later in the year, it is perfectly reasonable for them to instead start considering a plan B. And that, at long last, is where we come to the idea of Southwest buying another airline. You see, the problem here isn't something that Southwest could just get around by ordering a bunch of planes from Airbus, for example. Now, what the airline needs is a fleet of relatively small and efficient new planes to replace their 737-700s, but Southwest wants these aircraft to also arrive very quickly for such a huge commitment to a new type to make sense, and Airbus just can't do that. The European manufacturer would probably love to steal a Boeing customer this way, but that's just not possible. Even though Airbus haven't had nearly as much trouble as Boeing has had recently, they have still faced their own supplier problems and delivery delays, and they have to think of their existing customers. So that leaves only the option of buying another airline, one that already has a decent fleet of small narrow bodies, preferably also with more on the way. Now, that might be possible, but is it realistic? Well, Southwest's pilot union, SWAPA, certainly seems to think so. Earlier this year, the union hired the services of several law firms in order to protect their pilots' rights if a merger was actually becoming announced. You see, pilots often have a lot to lose when mergers and acquisitions happens because of merging seniority lists, changes in SOPs, route networks, and in this case also possibly the aircraft type. But who could Southwest actually buy to fulfill all of these requirements? Well, here we also have to bear in mind that there has been some recent bad history of merger attempts in the United States. I recently covered how JetBlue tried and then failed to acquire Spirit Airlines, and that happened because regulators intervened and they were worried about the loss of affordable ticket options for the passengers. Of course, in reality, that's a debatable risk when the airline that was being bought might go bankrupt if it isn't, but that's another story. But related to that merger, some industry commentators have actually now suggested that Southwest could possibly be interested in buying JetBlue. But if Southwest's goal is to acquire smaller planes, well then that doesn't make a lot of sense either. And the same goes for Spirit and basically any other user of similarly sized Airbus single-aisle jets. In reality, there aren't really a lot of airlines with large existing orders for modern small jets out there to choose from. But interestingly though, over a year ago, Judson Rollins in Leham News suggested another airline that Southwest could potentially buy. And that's Breeze Airways. This airline emerged and grew after the worst of the pandemic had subsided, initially with a fleet of used Embraer E190s and E195s. But interestingly, Breeze have also ordered the Airbus A220 and has already started taking delivery of a few of them. When they all arrive, Breeze will have a fleet of 90 super efficient A220-300s, which, by the way, have a cabin with 137 seats, nice and close to the 143 seats of Southwest 737-700s, but much more efficient overall. Leham News reported that Airbus commercial CEO Christian Scherer traveled over to the US in April last year and had meetings with people from both Southwest and Breeze. And this wasn't the first time that Southwest had looked at getting the Airbus A220 either. They also held talks with Airbus about that same aircraft back in 2020 during the 737 MAX grounding because they were worried about the lack of progress around the MAX-7. So, will they afford to sit with their arms folded now, possibly for 2 more years? Maybe Breeze would be a good candidate actually. Anyway, the key point here is that under any scenario where Southwest buys another airline, that would effectively mean the death of the Boeing 737 MAX-7. Boeing 737 MAX-10 is also facing serious delays, but in contrast to its smaller brother, that aircraft has orders from a wide variety of different airlines. The 737 MAX-7 really only have one major customer, and that's Southwest. Now, other airlines have placed some small orders for it, but Southwest orders are what has kept this aircraft in development. Needless to say, losing Southwest, which is probably the most loyal airline customer of them all, would be a devastating blow to Boeing, likely way worse than the loss of the MAX-7 itself. So it will be interesting to see how they will respond if something like this starts to become more of a reality. What do you think? Will Southwest try to buy an airline to get out of this dilemma, and can you think of another airline that they could potentially go for? Let me know in the comments below. Now we, the team behind Mentor Pilot and Mentor Now, are constantly looking for more interesting news and developments in the airline business, and if you have something that you think that we should cover, well then let us know as well. You can also support the work that we do by sending us super thanks, buying some merch, or even join the inner circle of my Patreon crew. Everything is hugely helpful and appreciated. Have an absolutely fantastic day wherever you are, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!